Well, hey everybody, thank you for joining us for our very first video recorded podcast episode. And you're in for a treat because our guest today is my mom, Wendy Smith. And so we want to just jump right into our conversation with her. If you're a listener and you've already heard some of our episodes, one thing that you'll pick up right away is that the podcast was actually my mom's idea. So we will talk about that in a little bit. But hi, Mom.
Hi.
And Aaron.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
So we just want to hear. Why don't we start by telling our listeners just a little bit about you, and what by we? I mean, how about you start by telling our listeners a little bit about you, where you grew up, and if you grew up in a Christian home, that sort of thing.
Okay. Well, I grew up in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. My younger years were in Warminster, but we moved to the Pocono Mountains. Come from a family of 6 kids, 5 girls and 1 boy. My family would probably say they were a Christian family, but they were not. Mm-hmm. And so there was no real Christian emphasis or truth lived out in my family. Mm-hmm. And so without much grounding, I after I graduated from high school, I went to nursing school. And out of nursing school, I worked about a year and a half in the civilian world, and then I went into the Air Force, and I was a nurse in the Air Force. And from the time I was 21 till I was 27, I lived a pretty rebellious life. And not that I'm proud of it, I won't share the details, but God used it to bring me to a point where I saw my need for Him. And I came to Christ when I was stationed in Patrick Air Force Base, Florida. I worked with I was almost 27 at the time, and I worked with a young medical technician. His name was Rick Hammond. Rick, if you're listening, you had a great impact. I was almost 27. Rick was 21. We worked the night shift at the hospital. He was married, he had 2 kids, was really a happily married man, talked about his family and everything. And at night, after everybody went to sleep and we were doing our night tasks and everything, he would always share his faith with me. He was an excellent worker, great guy to work with. I would make fun of him in a friendly way, and he cared about me. I can say that now because he risked mockery. Yeah. And but he was planting seeds. I would tell him, that's not for me. You're brainwashed. But he was planting seeds. And then a friend of mine had gone through a divorce. Believe it or not, I took Taekwondo back then. And a friend of mine had gone through a divorce who was in Taekwondo with me. And about a month or 2 later, she called me and she said, Wendy, something wonderful's happened. I've been born again. And I kind of cringed. I was raised in the feminist movement and the Jesus movement and everything. And I thought it was a fad. But then she invited me to church. And I didn't even have a Bible. And hers was a red letter Bible. And it got my attention. And about a week later, I was just overwhelmed with the fact that I needed a Savior. And so in my living room, not knowing how to pray or anything, I just gave my life to the Lord. And I've never looked back. It's been a wonderful journey. And so we're still on it together.
Yeah. Wait, okay, because I love how you and Dad met, because Dad wasn't a believer, right? Could you tell that story too?
Sure. So I met your dad about a year later, and about 2 weeks before I met him.
In Alaska.
In Alaska. I was stationed there. He had been, but came back as a civilian. And 2 weeks before I met him, I kind of surrendered dating to the Lord. I was dating unsaved guys and, wasn't living my faith as strongly. I was letting them pull me back. And I was a young Christian. I wasn't really being discipled or anything. And I met your dad in church, but he was there to check out the gymnasium. He was not a believer. He was a very athletic, still is, but he was very athletic. And in Alaska, was looking for a gym indoors where he could work out. And he
close to his apartment, so he could run to it.
Right. And he had come to church and had seen that there was a singles Bible study and thought, I'll go to that and check out the gym. So we met then. And he was seeking. He was honestly a seeker. We started, our first month of dating was at church, and I bought him a Bible, which talked about the Lord, and he came to the Lord about a month afterwards. And
But wait. Because you got to back up, because after the singles meeting,
Mm-hmm.
he said, "Hey, can I get your number?"
Oh yeah.
And you
Well, after
said,
the singles meeting, we talked a little bit, and then I walked out to the parking lot with him, and he was a sorry sight. I mean, his hair was down to his shoulders. He had a blue jean jacket with battery acid holes in his. But so we parted ways, and then the next Sunday he came to the single Sunday school class because he had forgotten to get my number.
That's why he came back.
Oh.
And so he came late, hung around the door till I got out, and asked me if I'd be interested in going out sometime. I said, well, maybe. And he said, well, can I have your phone number? And I said, well, I'll give it to you when we go to church. And he said, oh, I wasn't going to go to church. And I said, well, you don't go to church, you don't get my number. So works every time.
He went to church.
And that's all
And
she wrote.
39 years
Oh,
later.
right.
Okay, so I want to hear a little bit more too about when you say you were part of the feminist movement, and then you mentioned the Jesus movement too. So for listeners who maybe don't or might just have a different idea of what those actually mean. So when you say feminist movement,
Mhm.
what time period are you talking about? And then what ideas for
I
you
know,
came
you're
along
trying to
with
find
that?
out my age.
No, I'm not. Okay,
it.
don't say the years.
No,
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
no. I don't mind.
A while ago.
Oh,
So
few years ago.
I graduated from high school in 71 and
Okay.
nursing school in 73. Like Roe v. Wade was passed at the same time I graduated from nursing school. So, there was a real push on abortion, Gloria Steinem, and, women didn't need to be married. They didn't need men. And so, I wasn't all sold on that, all out on that, but it certainly influenced it.
Mhm.
And it influenced my mom. There were 5 girls in the family, and my mom would let me read things that were not age appropriate on occasion, but I think she was helping me become more liberal in my thinking and everything.
Mhm.
And she probably thought that was the right thing to
Absolutely.
do, to expose
absolutely.
you so you could explore.
Yeah, I'm not faulting my mom at all. I mean,
Right.
she was going through that movement herself
Mm.
with
Trying
5
to
girls.
make sense of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and around the same time in the early 70s were, the real Jesus movement with the hippies and everything else. So.
Yeah.
And did you kind of roll your eyes at them?
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. I just thought, that's a fad
Yeah.
kind of thing. I never took it real serious or anything
Yeah.
at all.
So you didn't necessarily, because you said your family would identify as Christian probably. Do you kind of mean that culturally? Like almost like culturally they would say, oh yeah, we're Christians.
Yeah.
But so you
Absolutely.
didn't have necessarily a hostile view towards religion, or do you
No,
think as
no,
you
I
got
wasn't hostile.
Okay.
It just meant nothing.
Mm-hmm.
We would pray at meals, and I can remember the prayer. Thank you for the world so sweet. Thank you for the food we eat. Thank you for the birds to sing. Thank you, God, for everything. We just rattled it off fast because there were a lot of kids and you wanted to eat.
Yes.
So I wasn't bitter to religion, but I just didn't think it had no place.
Mm-hmm.
If I could describe my life before Christ, I just spit in his face. I mean, I just didn't give him a thought, didn't value it. It just had nothing. We didn't go to church. We went when I was real little because of the community we lived in at the time. But my critical years, we didn't go to church.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wasn't opposed. I wasn't angry. It just had no place.
Yeah. So then now you're a nurse and you become a believer. What were even in that first year or so some big shifts that you saw in even your worldview and how you started to see things?
Well, fortunately, we got into a good church. And so Fred and I were really getting grounded. We were serving the Lord together. I was really being fed and nurtured. And so it was eye-opening. Just a different perspective on things. I would never say I was pro-abortion, but I would have said, well, it's not for me, the typical thing.
Right.
But as a nurse, I knew science. And as I grew and matured as a Christian, science was growing and maturing. When I was graduating from nursing school, ultrasounds were not available. They were in research. They were the size of a room,
Right.
But now we have ultrasound and fetal electrophysiology, and they do surgery in utero, and we know so much more.
Yeah.
And so as a Christian, I just grew in my profession and just looked at the world totally different.
Yeah.
I really feel blessed. Fred, after we'd been married about a year, Fred went to seminary. And not because he wanted to be a pastor, but he was just so hungry for the word. And while he was in seminary, he was going to seminary in Pennsylvania. Then I got assigned to Andrews Air Force Base. So I was in Washington, D.C. He would be gone during the week, and I'd be kind of like single parenting. And people say, well, how did you do that for 3?
And working full time.
And working full 12-hour shifts. Half the time I was 12-hour shifts in the intensive care unit. But I loved that time because as Fred was growing, I was being fed through him, and he became such a godly man. In fact, when he graduated from seminary, I can remember we were at a food buffet, and one of his professors was on the other side getting food, and he looked at me and he said, Wendy, Fred is a man above reproach.
Wow.
And that has stuck with me. So
don't cry, Mom. You're gonna make me cry.
Tissues.
I know.
Tissues. But so I never look back. My growth has been wonderful. In fact, I think someday I'm going to write a women's devotional that's going to be called "Growing Old is Not for Wimps." Running the race
should.
and finishing well.
I love it. You should do it.
Yeah.
You can buy that on Amazon. No, I'm just kidding.
I gave the title to Cynthia. She loved it.
Oh yeah,
Yes.
I love that. You should totally do that, Mom.
Yeah.
Well, and so here, one of the things that's always impressed me, but even more so now that I'm a mom, is Mom always worked full time. Sometimes she was going to school at the same time, and but somehow she would always make it to all the events, and we'd always have an amazing meal on the table. And I can barely get myself together to get a meal on the table some days.
I used to draw pictures on your lunch bags.
Yes, she'd pack my lunch all the way into high school, which maybe you should have made me do that. But I'm so grateful for that. But there were some funny moments. I mean, like the one time she had gotten off of a 12-hour shift, and I just remember vaguely this story. But when you called the fire department.
Oh gosh, yes.
Tell about that.
So we lived in base housing, military housing, and we lived in like a townhouse. It was a 4-unit, and this was around the mid 1980s, and smoke detectors were just kind of relatively new. And I remember my neighbor had problems with her smoke detector, so I had gotten off a 12-hour shift working intensive care unit. I'd pick Sarah up at 7:30. We'd play. I'd make her lunch. I'd take a 2 or 3 hour nap with her, and then I'd be getting back to work.
Oh.
So this one day, I thought my smoke detector had gone off. And I'm walking through the house, didn't smell smoke or anything. But because I'm in base housing, I couldn't turn it off. I had to I had to call it in.
Oh.
And so I called it in, and I said, look, there's no smoke. Don't make it like a big thing. And they come down with all their gear. They walk into the house. One of the guys walks upstairs. They're looking around. He walks into the bedroom and turns off my alarm clock.
Oh no! It was your alarm.
It was my
time.
alarm clock.
But you were so tired.
I was so tired. And each year, because you lived in base housing, you had to go to a mandatory safety briefing, and they would give stories about, house fires, or things, accidents and stuff like that. And that one year, they talked about this woman whose alarm clock.
They actually talked about you. With
just a little, lighten the humor kind of thing.
Did they know it was you? Or
No.
There
were thousands in the auditorium, and I was under the chairs.
Yeah,
I mean, I didn't.
You were the example. That's so funny.
I probably was asleep.
You're like, not
So-
to name any names.
Yeah. So how long then did you serve in the military?
I was 12 and a half years active duty and 3
Wow.
reserves. I loved the Air Force. I went in as a single. I wanted to travel. I had wonderful opportunities. It just professionally, it helped me grow.
Mhm.
The only reason I got out is I felt, because Fred had finished seminary in 87,
Mhm.
and I didn't want to uproot my family all the time. And I felt like we wanted to be in the Lord's will, not necessarily Uncle Sam's. And so I just chose to get out. But I stayed in the reserves and for 3 years. But then the military started changing. I got out when President Clinton came in. There was just social engineering kind of things, and I thought, I can't support this.
So then did you then shift to nursing in just the private sector?
Yeah.
Or okay.
Yep, I've worked my entire life until 2 years ago. Yahoo!
Mm-hmm.
And then you were got involved with cancer nursing and got your nurse practitioner degree.
When I was in Andrews Air Force Base, half the time I was in the intensive care unit, and then I was asked to take charge of the cancer clinic. So my last couple of years, I was an oncology nurse, and then when I got out, I went back to school and became a nurse practitioner in hematology oncology.
So one thing I want to talk about is I want to just kind of tell the listeners about how this whole idea came about. So it was 2 summers ago now. You came to me and you were like, what if we write a book together? Because, you said, I grew up in the feminist movement. Here you are raising girls. We both care about this topic. And so we were going to write a book together. And then I was like, well, if we're interviewing all these people, let's make it into a podcast. And you were like, I love it. But then life kind of happened and you were like, I just don't actually have space for this, but I want you to run with it. And that's when Erin came into the picture.
Well, I wanted to ask, can I piggyback on yours?
Go.
Okay, so what was going on with you when you came to Sarah with that idea? Were you seeing things in the culture? I mean, I know you're working with young women and you have a heart for the broken. So when you were thinking, Sarah and I should write a book about strong women, what was going on either in your life or just your thoughts?
That's a good question. So I'm kind of a strong-willed, assertive type of person. I'm a let's get her done kind of person. And I never saw myself in need of a mentor. But there were a couple times in my life where I went through a very difficult time. I don't want to be drama. Like one time I was working as a nurse practitioner. I was covering the clinic. The doctors that I worked with, one had to go to a funeral, one was at a conference, and one just quit. And so I had the whole clinic. I was sick. I was physically, emotionally exhausted. And that year was the one and only time we were volunteering for the navigators at the Air Force Academy. And it was the only time that I got a free book around Christmas from the navigators. And it was a book by Cynthia Heald called Becoming a Woman of Strength. And I got the book on a Thursday, and Fred said, Wendy, you need a rest. Why don't we go to Glen Erie, take a little mini spiritual retreat? So we did. And that night, I was on my knees 5 hours. I read the entire book, looked up every scripture, prayed over it, and felt refreshed.
Wow.
And then there was another time, a year ago in March, Fred had a stroke. He's doing well. We've saw many miracles. But I had just read another one of Cynthia's books called Becoming a Woman Whose God is Enough. And I wouldn't have thought I needed it. I was reading it so I could mentor others. But as Fred was put on the ambulance, I'm grabbing my car keys. Certain things that Cynthia had pointed out, scripture that she had pointed out, came to my mind. And I just said, God, you've got this. And I cannot tell you the peace that I had. And just even in the crisis, I just had peace. And we saw God at work. My eyes were just ready to see it. And so after that, I started thinking about women in my life that had had an impact. When I was a brand new first lieutenant, there was a lieutenant colonel who gave me her flight wings. She had been a medevac flight nurse and encouraged me to become a flight nurse, which I did. And when I finished, she gave me her wings. So she had launched my career. Cynthia helped me in a time where I didn't know I was going to have a need, but God knew. And I started thinking about that and thinking in our culture, we when we think of strong women, it's women that, just conquer the world kind of on their own. They don't need the man. To me, it's a beautiful thing to have the strength of Christ in you. It's like 2 Corinthians 12:9, where he says, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. And then that's when Paul goes on to say, therefore I will boast gladly about my weaknesses so that
Mhm.
Christ's power can rest on me. And so in those times when I'm weak, I can feel Christ's power.
Mhm.
And that's what I wanted to share with the next generation, kind of.
Mhm.
It's funny, that story actually reminds me of, even since we've started this podcast and we've taken your idea and done this. We did an episode with a friend of ours whose kids are medically fragile, and
I heard
the
that one.
day her episode aired, we got a message of a woman who was sitting in a hospital waiting room and got some bad news about her husband, and that episode was playing that day, and she sat there and listened to it, and I think she said something about, by the end of the episode, just listening to Marie, another woman,
Mhm.
she was able to say, "Thy will be done." And so it's like your idea
Mhm.
is coming to fruition through the stories of these women, which you knew you knew would happen.
Well, so often we think, I often think that I'm like a little grain of sand on the big sea,
Mhm.
and that I don't have a platform. But the women who've touched my lives probably don't know how much
Yeah,
they touched my life.
that's so true.
Yeah.
And so you just never know.
Yeah.
And I pray that I have had an impact in someone's life.
You have, Mommy. I mean, I can speak for myself. You've had a huge impact in my life, just watching you on so many levels. But the way you love Dad, the way you invest in others, and then another thing is kind of along the same lines of investing in others, doing the big and small things. One thing that impresses me so much about you that I learned from a lot is you see an issue or you see a challenge and you say, something needs to be done about that. And you don't look around like, who's going to do this? Like you say, me, I'm going to do this. Okay. Here's the game plan. I'm going forward. And you advocate for things, but you also don't forget the people.
Mhm.
And so I'm watching that in your life right now. And I've watched it all my growing up years, but specifically right now, I'm seeing it more clearly, the way you and Dad have invested in the prison ministry, the way you invest in the anti sex trafficking thing. So I'd love to just kind of transition and talk about what you care about right now, like what pulls your heart, and just share with us a little bit about that.
Well, I think my entire spiritual journey, I've been pro-life. I mean, as I mentioned, I just looked at life differently, and
Mhm.
I look at our culture and I tell people when I talk about these issues, pornography, sex trafficking, abortion, homelessness, drug addiction, you can't separate them.
Mhm.
They're all part of a very dark, evil web that entraps people.
Mhm.
Like in Timothy, they're taken captive to do the devil's will, and they don't even know that they're prisoners of war. They don't know it, and so to me, it's a matter of human dignity. I think if you're pro-life, you have to fight for human dignity in all those areas, and so those are my passions. They're so intimately connected. So we've been in prison ministry 17 years, and I've seen the impact culture has had on people from all different perspectives, from the broken families when someone goes to prison, from the inmates and the issues that they struggle with, and to the girls that I mentor. It's a dark world out there. I don't know if David Theroux was a Christian, but I remember this quote of his just haunts me. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation.
Mm-hmm.
So when I look at the culture, that's what I see. And we have hope. We have the truth. And so I want to be able to speak truth into them. You know, the first verse I memorized when I came to Christ was Psalm 40, verse 1, where he brought me out of the miry clay and set my feet on a rock and put a new song in my heart. I want the girls that I mentor to hear that song, to have their feet on solid rock. You know, and people say, well, how can you go into the prison? You know, people have committed horrible crimes. I mean, we even have had the opportunity to go in the Supermax, highest security prison in the country, to minister to a guy there who's done horrible things, but he became a Christian by reading Romans, not under anybody's preaching. And God can change lives. And so we want to do that. We want to speak that into their lives.
Yeah, I think that's so, I love how you wove that together, because so often the criticism will be heaped on those of us who are pro-life that, that's the only issue we care about. Yeah. And that we don't advocate for outside of the womb, that we're just concerned about inside the womb. And there are so many of us like you who are quietly living a life that's contrary to that message. And giving your time and your husband's time to loving the unlovely is a beautiful picture of that. Of course, that's how Colson Center started. That's how Chuck Colson came to be born again. So in line with the Colson Center, but also too, I know you spend time mentoring young women who are having to live in safe houses. So for listeners who maybe don't know about this ministry that happens all around the country, can you talk to us about that, the whole safe house and the women who are living there?
Let me put one caveat.
Yes.
I would love to talk about, but let me just say one thing to challenge listeners in the church, is that these issues feed off each other. And I really would, if I could speak to pastors everywhere, I would say, deal with pornography. Deal with pornography. It is huge, and it just feeds the trafficking. It feeds. There are what there used to be child abuse, but it's called child sexual assault. It's overwhelming law enforcement and FBI to the point where they have to focus on infants and toddlers because they don't have the resources and energy. But pornography feeds that, and it's everywhere. And we try to get into churches to talk about trafficking, and it's like, it's not happening here, but it is. And I could give you story after story.
Yeah, can you make the connection? I think you're right. So can you help make the connection for people? And how does pornography, what does it have to do with sex trafficking and that connection? Why is that? Why does pornography feed into that view of women and people?
I'm so glad you asked that question. Well, so pornography, research is showing that pornography stimulates the same dopamine receptors as cocaine, as drugs do. So people who view pornography, if the more they view, the more they need. And there have been Senate hearings showing how that feeding on pornography, you'll probably get negative feedback. People will say, oh, I watch pornography. I don't go out and rape. But it does, the longer you're viewing it, it does cause you to want more and more variety, perversion, whatever you want to say. And it is addictive. And how it ties into trafficking is that often girls are forced to watch it so that they are groomed and prepared to provide what the purchaser wants. People who view pornography don't, just think it's victimless. But as one survivor told me, they don't see the threats off stage. They don't see someone holding a gun to you or threatening your family if you don't do what they want you to do. They don't see the drugs that you're forced to take. One girl said she came out of trafficking when she was in her early 20s, and she told me, she said, I feel like I'm being raped every day because I was trafficked as a child all the way up. Those pictures are out there. It's like cycling over and over, and I can't reclaim them. And so when people who view it don't realize not everybody's doing that voluntarily. And I would say probably most are not. But it fuels it. There's so much money. Consumers of pornography spend more on pornography than consumers of online news, online video games, and online sports together. Wow. There are more hits for pornography than there are views on Amazon, Netflix, Twitter, and I can't remember the last one, together, combined.
Mm.
It's huge, multi-billion-dollar business. And so at the same time, traffickers are making $1,000 a night off a girl or a boy. So there's huge money there.
Mm.
It's all dark. It's all tied together.
Yeah.
And so
I appreciate that because often I don't know if I would make the connection of thinking about sex trafficking and then connecting that
Mhm.
to pornography, but it completely makes sense that it would.
And we don't even have a handle on how big
Mhm.
the problem is. In 2019, Facebook reported to the Center for Missing and Exploited Children that they had, I want to say, it was 17 million viewers on or images that they
Mhm.
grouped. But Amazon, Snapchat, Dropbox, they don't screen. They don't report.
Mm.
And they are almost, all these platforms are given immunity almost
Mhm.
through the Communications Act, Section 230 of the Communications Act. And there's a bill in the Senate trying to turn that around and have accountability. People should call their senator. And it's Senate Bill 3398. But anyhow, it's just, people just don't realize it is so. And now that kids are going to school online, the perpetrators are out there. They know how to hit the kids. And yeah. I could go
Can
on.
you, without reveal, I know, and I love your passion because it's such an important issue, and it's just so, it's everywhere in our culture. And like you
is.
said, we think, oh, that's something that happens in another country or another time, and it's happening now. Could you share, without revealing personal details, about the girls that you're mentoring that you go and visit in the safe house? Can you tell one or two of their stories?
I can't tell the stories of the girls that are there now.
Okay.
But I can tell you about the safe house. It's called Sarah's house.
Okay.
Sarah's home, excuse me. And it's in a rural area, and they take in girls that are 12 to 18 years old.
Okay.
Is there a way for us to link to
sarashhome.us?
Okay, so they can donate if a listener feels ready.
Yes. And they can learn more about
Okay.
some of the trafficking.
So the girls that are coming there are, without telling personal stories, these are girls who have been rescued or who have run away, or
both.
Okay.
I mean, in fact, kids who run away, boys and girls, are hit up by a trafficker within the first 48 hours. So a lot of them, the trafficker they're so keen on recognizing these kids, and they'll go up to a kid, hey, you look like you need a place to stay tonight. And kid has nowhere to go, and then they're trapped. So, but I can tell you, one of my friends, she has a ministry called Compass 31. Her name's Jenny Sue Jessen. She was trafficked by her grandfather from the age of 14 to 17.
Wow.
And tied into pornography. She told me that her grandfather would film it. He'd blackmail those that were purchasing her services, and he'd sell the. So he had three ways of making money off her through trafficking and pornography. But some of them are runaways. They may come from very broken homes. They may come from the foster system. Parents may be incarcerated, so they may be. They just haven't had anyone to teach them healthy life skills, and they run. Some of them have been trafficked by their friends at school, are actually trafficked in high school. A students, maybe cheerleaders, athletes, and they're trafficked through the peers at school. Trafficked some women are trafficked right out of prison. Some kids out of juvenile detention because the traffickers know where to look for them. Drugs is a problem. It kills me that states are moving toward legalizing. Why would you legalize heroin? Why would you allow a 15-year-old to use heroin? I can tell you about one girl that I am mentoring over the phone in another state who overdosed on heroin twice in 1 week. She's a teenager. The second time was serious. They used Narcan 4 times, and they didn't revive her. She was in the unit for a night or two. So, I mean, it's sad. It is very sad. These kids often have PTSD because there's landmark studies showing how abusive the trafficking is. Beaten, burned, tattooed, hair pulled out, punched in the mouth, head trauma from being slapped upside the head, just murdered, just violent. It can be very violent. So they come broken. They are very broken. PTSD, physically, emotionally, spiritually broken kids.
So how did you start getting involved? Like someone listening who's thinking, I would love to do something about it, but I'm a college student, or I'd love to do something about it, but I'm a widow in my 70s. Is there anything?
Wait, I gotta say something here because Dad and I always joke that anytime Mom starts volunteering for something, Dad and I look at each other and we're like, they don't know what they're getting, because she revolutionizes wherever she volunteers. She's like, I'll tell you what needs to be done, and I'm gonna do it. But you started with just at your church, right? Doing backpacks.
Right.
Okay.
So first, let me say that if anybody wants online resources where they can learn more or find out how to get involved, I'll be glad to. And a lot of places,
you can give that to us, and we'll put it in the show notes for people.
Yeah.
Okay.
And also they can look for community organizations. I volunteer with the Human Trafficking Task Force of Southern Colorado, which is a very active group. And it's made up of concerned citizens, and our meetings are quite diverse. Sometimes it's a lot of concerned citizens. Sometimes the district attorney's office is representative, or the law enforcement. And I also am a volunteer of another coalition in town. There's an organization here in Colorado Springs called Restore Innocence, and they make backpacks for kids that are rescued off the streets. Used to be they made them for kids 12 to 18. Now they make them from infant on, from newborn on.
That's heartbreaking.
That's how bad it is.
Yeah.
But when these kids are rescued, they have what's on their back. You can't go home. You can't go to the motel. So, and law enforcement doesn't have change of clothes and hygiene for all these kids. They don't have the resources. So Restore Innocence will put together these backpacks to carry them through the first 24, 48 hours till they can find safe housing. Our church was participating in that. And then I got involved through the church, and then for the first 6 months after I retired, I was learning all about it. I connected with different anti-trafficking organizations in my community, trying to identify where the gaps were, and praying fervently, where can I help? I have been richly blessed. Sarah's my only child. I have 4 grandkids.
And I mean,
yeah.
I'm just kidding.
I used to put a sign on her bedroom that says, "Do not enter disaster zone. Enter at your own risk."
Yes, totally true.
But anyhow, so there's local area ways you can get involved. I would encourage to have someone come into your church or men's group or women's group and just tell them about human trafficking. Or even reach out to some, I don't know if every community, I doubt if every community is, but like Colorado Springs, we have the Internet Crimes Against Children, which is a subtask group of the FBI, and they've presented with me on internet safety for kids and things like that. So there's a lot of resources out there.
And I think it's really encouraging, your whole story, because you started off just doing the next thing that was in front of you. You know, you said, okay, I'll help volunteer at the church. And then you're like, maybe there's more I could do. And you prayed about it, and you just did the next small thing that came in front of you. And the other thing that I want to go back to that I already mentioned, but you're advocating for this, and then you're also investing in relationships. So not everything is seen, and not everything would be big in the world's eyes, but doing that next thing and investing well. I have to tell one more story about you, because I mean, I've got a lot. We could be all but I on the way here, I was just telling Aaron about that, how you are you care about issues, you learn about them, you're telling anybody that will listen, but also you look for the relational side and who it's impacting. And I think that's just such a treasure. It's your gifting. You're good at that, and Dad, of course, plays into that a lot too because he's so relational. But I just love. I don't remember what the story was that you read in the newspaper, but I think it was an opinion piece a couple months ago, and the guy was very against Christian ideas, even just the church in general. He just was real antagonistic towards it. And you guys were like that. Oh, he's never met a Christian. And so tell about that.
Well, it was more. He was wondering why Christians would take certain stands in politics.
Oh, okay.
And at first, I thought, well, I'm going to write a counter piece to it because I like to write. But then I thought, no, everybody's yelling at each other today, and I really wanted to engage this guy to get why has he felt that way, and just to share why we feel the way we were. So I sent an email to the editor of the opinion section and said, would you forward this to the writer, because there was no information, and tell him we want to have him for dinner. So we had him over for dinner, and we had a wonderful time. It really was, because we could talk one-on-one.
Yeah.
And heard why he felt the way he did, and explained why we feel the way we do. And it was a very positive. I'd do it again in a heartbeat.
I just love that.
Gosh.
I just love that.
I would like to say one thing, and I hate to use global statements like the church or Christians or whatever, but we live in a very superficial culture, and people get involved with different good organizations, but it becomes a adding fluff to your resume, I guess you could say. Right. Like you have this ministry or what, but you're not getting your hands dirty.
Yeah.
And I think that Romans 12 verses 9 through 18 is such a great outline for ministry, and it says, do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. And it talks right in the beginning of verse 9 about loving one another, honoring each other above yourself, and really and I don't want to say I'm all that in a bag of chips, because I'm still on this journey too, but to me, if we're going to engage the culture, if we're going to shed truth, then we really need to be involved. We need to get our hands dirty and not just build our resume.
Well, and what a great,
that's quotable.
Yes. And what a great, the inviting him over for dinner is something I never would have thought of. And it's something, okay, maybe not that exact thing, but it's something we can all do. And I think it taps into seeing people as people. You saw the writer as a person, and you thought there's probably more underneath here, and I'd love to know what it is. And to invite him over, I think it takes courage, first of all, and just love that obviously you and your husband have for people. But what a great story. And it encourages me to think, okay, what are the small things I can do like that?
It's kind of mystery hospitality, because Fred and I were trying to guess, what does he look like? And, is he going to yell at us? Or, he didn't look at all like what we thought. And it turned out to be a very pleasant experience.
Yeah, he did yell at you. But you were prepared. You were willing to do that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's transition a little bit. And we like to ask our guests at the end of our episodes a couple questions. And one of them is, what advice would you give to young women today?
Okay, I'm going to use scripture.
Okay.
In Matthew, the greatest command, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And we read that, we hear that. And then in Romans, going back to Romans 12, between verses 9 and 18, it says, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. When I put those two verses together, I would tell young girls to start every day like a racehorse. And that's what I want to do. And when you think about a racehorse, at the gate, they're stomping the ground. Their muscles are twitching. Steam's coming off their back. They're snorting. They have been trained, and they're ready to run. They have blinders on, so they're not distracted on either side. You open that gate, and they're running with all their heart to the goal. And I would tell young girls today, run like a racehorse. Run with zeal for Christ. You know, we can talk about him. We can go to church. We can be involved in the youth group, but run the race with your eyes on Christ. Our culture desperately needs young people who will run with passion and courage and not have fear. Right. You know, there's so many verses about being strong and having no fear. And I think of one of the verses I claim so often is Psalm 62, verses 5 and 8, where it says, yes, my soul find rest in God. My hope comes from him. He is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will not be shaken. And I want to, like that devotion I'm going to write sometime, run the race well, run the race hard and finish well. And you start when you're young. Don't be ashamed. Right. God's on your side.
Okay, we know you're a reader from already your story about your life. So we'll put in the show notes the books you mentioned that were your mentoring books, those 2 mentoring books you mentioned. But what books are you reading right now? Or book? What book are you reading right now?
Can I tell a funny story on myself?
Yes.
A lot of the people you interview, they'll tell about how their parents read to them and they got their interest in books. And I was the worst mom that way because I really was. I would read like Dumbo or whatever, Pinocchio, you know, like books. Because if I sat down to read a chapter book when I was working full time, I would fall asleep or hallucinate. I can remember waking up. I caught myself. I said, "Go get the defibrillator." And I'm looking at Sarah. She's like 2 or 3 years old, and she's like trying to repeat that word, like the da.
That's so funny.
The books. I would love to say I'm as well read as many of the people you interview. My whole profession, my whole career, because I was in a rapidly changing health science. I was always reading professional journals and drug package inserts and trying to learn about the latest technology. Nowadays, I get those journals and I trash them and do a happy foot dance. And I probably have read more in the last 2 years. But what I'm reading right now is another book by Cynthia Heald that I just found I hadn't read called, I think it's called Living Wisely, Living the Truth of Scripture. And then another book that I haven't gotten very far beyond the introduction and first chapter, but it's by Larry Crabb, and it's called A Different Kind of Happiness, and it's about sacrificial love.
I love his books.
Well, you're reading another gospel too. I noticed that.
I finished it.
Oh, you finished it. Okay. Yeah.
I'm going to pass it on.
And Mom went through the Colson Fellows when it was Centurions back in what?
2008.
2008. So she went through that program too. So you're a learner too. Big time. I learned that from you.
That was squeeze that into working here.
Yeah, right. Okay, our last question, Mom, is if you could choose one lady from history that you'd love to have coffee with, who would it be?
You know, when I listen to your podcast, I think about that often, and especially in today's culture, like I thought about when people were sitting outside eating and the Black Lives Matter attacked them and said, say Black Lives Matter. And I think of Hebrews and the great cloud of witnesses. And, you know, I think of people who have been mentioned, Corrie ten Boom and Amy Carmichael and Perpetua, you know, the one that was killed. But there's women that they're unknown. Yeah. I remember one time reading about Solzhenitsyn, and he told about an older woman in the Gulag who was tortured every night because they wanted to find out where the priest was. And one night she said, "What can you do to me? You're afraid of your boss, you're afraid of each other, and I am not afraid to stand before my God." And I thought, you know, I would love to sit down with that old woman.
Yeah, right.
Or when I was in like 6th grade, I read a book about a missionary in China a woman who had her eardrums punctured and her tongue cut off so she could no longer hear scripture or share scripture. And you think about women in Korea, North Korea, or those in the underground church, or Nigeria, places around the world where they're persecuted. Any one of them I would love to sit down with, because that old woman in the gulag knew what the lordship of Christ was. And we need that. We need to know really what the lordship of Christ is.
Right.
It's just more than what we're fed on in this country. So I can't give you a specific name. Even yesterday, I was talking to a young girl that's an author. Her mom's 80, and her parents were missionaries in Japan. And as a child, she and her parents were in a Japanese concentration camp. So that may become a reality. I'd love to sit down and talk with her and have coffee.
Yeah.
So
I love that. Women, the unknown women.
The unknown women, the ones who really had to stand up for their faith and endure great persecution.
Well, we are so well, this was so fun for many reasons. One, because you're Sarah's mom, and we all love Sarah. And so to meet you is a treat, because you raised an amazing daughter. But also to have you on.
Just kidding.
But to have you on, because this was your vision, your idea, and we're so thankful for it. Because
I wish I could have told more stories on Sarah, though. You guys avoided those questions.
Yeah, Sarah, how'd you do that?
Yeah, that's great.
Can I tell the story about the solar eclipse?
Oh, yeah, you got to tell that
one.
one.
Yeah, go ahead.
We were talking
That's
before.
a good one.
When Sarah was in second grade, I think, she studied a solar eclipse, and she came home and she was so proud, and they had made some kind of visor.
Well, wait, first of all, remember that Mom is in the medical field, so everything is very medical. Even dinner time, she's talking about some, all the
war stories from the day.
Yes, all the war stories from the clinic.
Guts and gore.
Okay, continue.
So anyhow, Sarah comes home, and Fred and I and Sarah at the dinner table, and Sarah's dead serious and telling us about the solar eclipse. And then at the very end, she says, Mom, Dad, never, never look directly at the sun in a solar eclipse, because you'll burn your rectum.
Instead of the retina. You'll burn your rectum. And my mom's
and
like, I didn't know the sun shone down there.
She knew the word rectum because her mom was a very good nurse.
I would never want to know all the things she probably should told all her classmates.
I know.
So you couldn't read aloud to her, but you were teaching her things.
See,
constantly.
I know anatomy like nobody else, and blood conditions, and no. Well, thank you, Mom.
Yeah,
love you so much. I'm grateful for you.